Hi, so we're continuing our learning of, it's been a couple of weeks, but continuing our learning of Mishnah Shabbat. We're just going to do one Mishnah today because it's kind of a complicated one. So we're in chapter 2, Mishnah 3, and we're still dealing with the different materials that can or cannot be used for Shabbos lamps, for Shabbos, the wick for the lamp itself, what materials are appropriate. Because of maybe it'll be something that is not so good and you'll want to adjust it, or maybe it's something that has a terrible smell. Different considerations we have to think about. So the first line has to do with that. Kol hayotze min ha'etz ein madlikin bo, ela pishtan. We may not light with any product of a tree, ela, except for pishtan, except for flax, for linen. Okay, so that has to do with perhaps the flax. We know will light well. The wick will be, it's a good material to be used as a wick, and therefore we're not worried about having to adjust it. It's going to be a nice, firm, good flame. And no tree product, anything that comes from a tree, eno mitame, will not contract tumat ohalim. So that's the tuma that comes from being in an enclosed space, the tuma of tents. With a dead body from contact with that. So none of these tree products can contract tuma contamination from this tuma of sheltering, of ohalim, except for flax. Okay, so this gets a little bit complicated. This has to do with some verses in the Torah, how we derive these principles here. So we have one verse in Bamidbar that makes it sound like nothing about the ohel itself is becoming impure, but it's actually anything within it, anything that comes into the tent, anything that comes into the enclosed space, but the space itself perhaps doesn't become impure from the impurity of dead bodies. And then we have a verse that talks about purifying a tent, sprinkling on it, doing the purifying process on the tent. So how do we reconcile these two? It has to do with what tent comes to mean in that verse. We have another verse in the Torah that uses this term just tent to refer to a tent of linen, and therefore we assume that that's what it means, the verse having to do with the sprinkling, and therefore that is the only structure. If it's an unmovable structure, the actual tent itself, normally that will not contract tuma unless it is this version of ohel that is just ha'ohel, which is linen, and that will contract tuma even in this unmovable structure itself, not just the things that are inside of it. Okay, continuing on. Ptilat habeged shekipla velo hivhava. So a wick made from cloth that one twisted but did not singe. So we're going to have to also give a lot of background on this one. So let's pause there before we give the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. So what does this have to do with? So in order for something to be considered a beged, a cloth, anything of substance, it's have the status of beged and not just be some scrap. It has to be at least 3 finger widths by 3 finger widths in order to have this status of beged. And if it's smaller, it has no status. So something that does have a status of beged can contract tuma, ritual impurity, and something that doesn't have this status cannot. So the question is, if you have a beged, if you have something that is exactly 3 by 3, is exactly the minimum, and then you twist it and to make a wick. So now it visually looks smaller. It's still made out of the same mass, the same volume of material, but it's visually smaller. It has a smaller profile. Is it still considered 3 by 3? Which leads to, is it still considered a beged? Which leads to the question of something that is, we have this category of muksa, of things that we don't move, that we can't handle on Shabbat or Yom Tov. And the question of nolad, of something that came into being that didn't have an existing status or wasn't a certain thing until it came into being on Shabbat or Yom Tov, then you can't use it for the rest of Shabbat or Yom Tov. So that's one category it's a type of muksa. So we have the question of, did this thing already exist as less than 3 by 3 because it was twisted into a wick? Or did it still have its status of the 3 by 3 beged, of having the status of beged? And therefore, when we singe it, are we now making it less than the status of beged, or was it already less than the status of beged, if that makes sense? Is the singeing it, the actually using it to light your from a Yom Tov into Shabbat, you're using it to light your Shabbat candle, you're making it smaller in that moment. Was it already small enough that it didn't have a status of not being a beged, and therefore you're not creating anything new? It's going from being too small to have a status to even a little bit smaller, or is it going from just the minimum to have this status of beged, and now it's going to nothing because you're singeing it? So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Tme'ah, ve'ein madlikin ba. Rabbi Eliezer says it is susceptible to tumah contamination, and we may not light it. So therefore, he's saying that it still has the status of beged, Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore you couldn't light it because in that moment of singeing it, you would be making it smaller, making it a new thing, going from beged to not beged, and therefore not permissible to use for this Yom Tov into Shabbat. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Tehora umadlikin ba. So Rabbi Akiva says that the twisting itself does reduce the cloth's dimensions so that it no longer is able to contract tumah because it no longer has the status of beged already. So singeing it doesn't have a status change, and there's no nolad issue. There's no issue of creating something new on a Shabbat or holiday, and therefore you may light with it. So that Mishnah had a couple of different things going on with it, but we're still talking about what is permissible, what is not permissible for the Shabbat candles, lamps, and that discussion will continue next week. So look forward that now that we're resuming the study of Mishnah Shabbat. I'm looking forward to continue learning with you next week. Okay, all the best. Bye.